I'm Julian Murphy. I'm the Curator for Equality, Rights and Citizenship at LSE Library, and today we're going to talk about some of the interwar women's pamphlets that we have in the Women's Library and LSE Archives. And all of these pamphlets have been digitised, and you can look at least 1,000 more on our LSE digital library.
I'm Dina Gusejnova. I work at the Department of International History, and I'm interested in the intellectual history of the 20th century, particularly 20th century European political thought, but also changing ideas of citizenship in the 20th century. And I come to this collection both as a researcher and as someone who convenes courses dealing with questions like how did the world change after the First World War, and legal and intellectual changes, cultural changes in the interwar period. And I'm fascinated by this collection of interwar pamphlets, partly because I think the 20th century historians often don't tend to pay attention to pamphlets specifically as a coherent genre, but what's really interesting is, the pamphlets are, as a genre, it's one of the earliest forms of printing, really, since the invention of book printing, and it's always been a kind of favorite with progressives of various ages, so I don't know, in the Reformation or the English Civil War and various Enlightenment thinkers. And so just with this collection, you can see various shades of kind of movements, lobbyists, propagandists seeking change. At the end of the First World War, you should imagine it's a very changing political environment for many societies. So first, for example, there are materials related to the nationality of married women, which might sound like a sort of niche problem in a sense, but actually turns out to be one of the central obstacles for women's rights in the interwar period. And well, actually, it started already before the First World War, but was aggravated by the First World War. It's a problem that leading first-generation women barristers have highlighted in Britain, but there were other contemporaries internationally highlighting this, that women marrying foreigners were liable to lose their citizenship, but often the nationality or the state to which their husbands, whose citizenship their husbands had, would actually not automatically accept them as their citizens. So women could be stateless, or in the First World War it became apparent that women could also be treated as enemy aliens in their own country. And so these women used their connections often to mobilize and gather support for this bill. And ultimately they were successful partially, but it was a long period which kind of culminated in a legal change in 1933. The Women's Cooperative Guild that was involved both within Britain but also internationally in changing the economic situation of women through cooperatives. So they're visiting Austria, and they're particularly interested in highlighting or bringing to the attention of British readers the difficulty, first of all geopolitically, of Austria, which has been cut into pieces by the Versailles Peace Treaty and basically left as a kind of rump state without its economic base in the empire. But this has specific implications for women as members of the workplace, as citizens. So there's a particular proliferation of statelessness also among Austrian women, and there is also malnutrition among children and so on. So this pamphlet covers a lot of ground in kind of highlighting these situations. Kind of similarly here, there's some materials by the Women's International League which deal with the occupation of the Ruhr area, which was kind of part of the Versailles settlement dealing with Germany, and it was an attempt by France and Belgium particularly, but also supported by Britain to make sure really that Germany pays the reparations for the First World War. But it was actually an occupation that lasted 2 or 3 years, but there's a specific subpoint that sort of emerged in this context, and that was a preoccupation or kind of fear among the Western European establishment that the French army was using so-called colored troops, so the Senegalese soldiers fighting for the French army, as a kind of special force of terror against the German native population. So among this sort of generally rather progressive rhetoric, you will then find very classical racist tropes, which highlight the kind of the peril of white women and the supposedly confronted by the as it was then presented hypersexualized masculinity of the African soldiers. So this is, I think, quite an important document, or pamphlets like this, because they also correct, to some extent, our maybe what could be an implicit bias that we would want to find a kind of historically transcendent feminist who is always on the right side of history, always sort of advocating solidarities with oppressed groups. Another way to look at these pamphlets is as kind of a first stab at a kind of intellectual history of these particular women's groups' ideas of citizenship. So in this book here, a list of books for women citizens, published by the National Union of Societies for Equal Citizenship, you get a range of books on subjects, well, relevant to citizenship, including justice, the immediate organization of government, the very idea of citizenship, and also new institutions like the League of Nations. And what's immediately apparent is the strong focus on biography in such lists, which is something that wouldn't have occurred to me, that in such a kind of book, which is sort of introduction to civics in a way. This is particularly showing kind of the strength of the collection as a collection of British documents, but also with interest in international politics, international society of the period. So generally this collection is particularly strong when it comes to British sources, but it also features some really interesting gems really from international contexts. For example, you get here a rare pamphlet by the Russian feminist or Soviet feminist Alexandra Kollontai called Working Woman and Peasant Woman in Soviet Russia, published in her early work for the Women's Secretariat for the Comintern before she was kind of ousted from power there. You also get American sources, for example, from the US government Women's Bureau, which was founded around the same time as the so-called Zhena Del, that was the women's department of the Soviet Union that Kollontai worked for. So you can, in a way, track, using these kind of publications, how these different new organizations that were trying to defend and actually explore also the changing position of women in the workplace, how they kind of tried to institutionalize them in new forms of government after the First World War. On the other hand is a publication from the mid-1930s by the leading French lawyer Suzanne Greenberg, Le droit des femmes et les nouvelles constitutions, so about the right of women and the new constitutions. In many cases, the constitutions, far from ensuring the equality of women as citizens, actually ultimately have built-in kind of deprivileging actions where there were various exceptions applied, like the nationality law that I mentioned in the British case, where actually women can lose out, essentially, in other kind of circumscribed ways, and ultimately be kind of second-class citizens. Most of the continental countries are struggling with this problem of the threat to denaturalization of women due to marriage, essentially, and looking for different legal solutions to it. And these were kind of snapshots of how working with pamphlets might provide detailed answers in some cases, or in some cases just can lead to the discovery of relevant sources for bigger picture questions, like how did citizenship or ideas of citizenship change in the interwar period? Generally, how did women's activists change their interventions, really, in this period? So how did they lobby? Who did they lobby? What were the communities that they were part of?